In 1893, a city appeared, not a city that was planned over decades and built up district by district, not a city that grew from a trading post or a river crossing or a fort. A city that appeared, fully formed, on the southwestern shore of Lake Michigan, in a place that had been marshland 2 years before. 200 buildings, 65 miles of internal roads, a working railway system, elevated electrical infrastructure, lagoons, canals, a harbor, and covering every facade of every major structure, a gleaming white surface that gave the whole complex a name that survives to this day. They called it the White City. And then, within 14 months of its closing, almost all of it was gone. That is the official story, and at first it sounds like history. A World's Fair, a temporary exhibition, built to impress, never meant to last. The World's Columbian Exposition of 1893 in Chicago. 27 million visitors, a landmark of American ambition, a cultural watershed, and then, yes, demolished, as fairs are. That's the explanation, and it is the one that has satisfied the written record for over 100 years. But here's the first anomaly. Temporary structures don't look like that. I want you to find the photographs, not the modern restorations, not the artist's renderings, the actual photographic record from 1893, the glass plate negatives taken by the official photographer of the exposition, which survive in institutional collections and have been partially digitized. Look at those photographs carefully. Not what the guidebooks say you're seeing, what you actually see. What you see is this: buildings of a scale, an architectural complexity that the official construction timeline cannot comfortably explain. The Palace of Fine Arts, the Administration Building, the Transportation Building, the Manufactures and Liberal Arts Building, which was at the time of its supposed construction the largest enclosed structure on Earth. These are not tent pavilions. They are not exhibition halls in any sense that phrase has meant before or since. They are neoclassical monuments of a precision and proportion that took centuries to develop in Europe, and they appear here on a converted swamp in under 2 years, without apparent strain, without apparent difficulty, without a documented labor shortage, without a documented material bottleneck, and without a surviving account of anyone marveling at the speed of construction in the way you would expect someone to marvel if they were watching something genuinely unprecedented happen in real time. The official explanation says the buildings were constructed from a material called staff, a composite of plaster of Paris, cement, and jute fiber, mixed and applied over wooden frames, temporary by nature, inexpensive by design. And here is what is interesting about that explanation. It is internally coherent. Staff was a real material. It was used. Photographs of the construction process exist. Workers applying the compound to structural frames are documented. The explanation is not fabricated. And yet, staff does not produce what you see in those photographs. A staff building weathers quickly. It cracks. It shows its seams. It does not, under any standard application, produce the depth of shadow, the weight of cornice, the apparent density of carved stone that you observe in the photographic record of the White City. Researchers working in architectural history have noted this discrepancy without fully resolving it. The buildings look like stone, not like stone-colored plaster, like stone, and not newly cut stone. In several of the earliest available photographs, the buildings already show what appears to be the uneven patina of age, the darkening at the joints, the settling at the foundations that you associate with structures that have been standing long enough to respond to the weather. This is where the timeline becomes uncomfortable. The official construction record says ground was broken in earnest in 1891. The fair opened May 1st, 1893. 24 months for the largest building on Earth and the complex that surrounded it, and that is only the construction timeline. Before construction began, the site required comprehensive drainage. The marshland had to be stabilized, lagoons had to be dredged, a canal system had to be designed and executed. Frederick Law Olmsted, who designed the landscape plan, wrote extensively about the difficulty of working with the site. The infrastructure beneath the buildings had to be built before the buildings themselves could begin. And yet, somehow, within that same window, the architecture went up, all of it, in 2 years. I am not saying it is impossible. I am saying that for it to be true, certain things would need to be documented. The labor roles, the supply chain, the quarrying and delivery of materials, even synthetic materials at that scale, the engineering drawings that preceded construction, the surveying, the architectural coordination across 200 independent structures by a team of architects working in different cities. These things should have left records. Some records exist, but the records that exist have gaps in them that historians have noted and not pursued. Here is what repeats with unsettling precision. When you begin searching for the foundational documents of major structures in this period, not the operational records, not the fair guides, not the press coverage, but the foundational documents, the architectural commissions, the material invoices, the engineering surveys, you find yourself repeatedly arriving at the same situation. The operational life of the structure is extensively documented. The process by which the structure came into being is not. Now, let me be precise about what I am not claiming. I am not claiming that the 1893 fair was a fiction. 27 million people attended it. It was extensively photographed. It was written about in real time by journalists whose careers and reputations depended on accuracy. It happened. What I am asking is a narrower question. Did the buildings that housed it originate when we are told they did? That question sounds simple. It is not. Embedded in that question is a larger one that researchers working at the edges of what is academically permissible have been asking with increasing specificity. There is a body of architectural observation, not fringe observation, observation produced by people with professional credentials and institutional affiliations, that holds that a significant portion of the monumental neoclassical construction attributed to the 19th century cannot be accounted for by the construction methods and labor economics of the 19th century, that the timeline does not hold, that the scale of what was supposedly built globally, simultaneously, in a period of 50 to 80 years, exceeds what the documented industrial capacity of that period could have produced. The White City fits that pattern precisely. And here's the strangest part. The people who built it seem to have known something was unusual about it. Daniel Burnham, the director of works for the exposition, made a statement that has survived in the record and that is frequently quoted in architectural histories as a piece of American boosterism. He said, "Make no little plans. They have no magic to stir men's blood." Most histories present this as inspirational rhetoric. But in the context of what Burnham actually produced, what he actually oversaw, the statement reads differently. It reads like the statement of someone who was not designing something new, but revealing something that already existed, presenting it, framing it, not inventing it. Louis Sullivan, the architect whose transportation building was one of the few structures at the fair to deviate from the dominant neoclassical vocabulary, was famously hostile to the aesthetic direction of the exposition. He wrote that the damage wrought by the World's Fair would last for half a century. He was criticizing the adoption of a style he considered retrograde, European, imperial in its assumptions. His criticism has been read by architectural historians as an argument about taste. But consider what Sullivan was actually describing. He was describing a spectacle in which American architecture chose, voluntarily, systematically, to present itself in a vocabulary that predated it by centuries, not a vocabulary under development, not a new synthesis, an old vocabulary, reproduced with what Sullivan clearly experienced as disturbing fluency. His hostility was not the hostility of someone who disliked a rival style. It reads, in its original language, like the hostility of someone who found the fluency itself suspicious. This raises a question I keep returning to. Why would a country, in 1893, at the height of its industrial self-confidence, at the peak of its technological ambition, choose to present itself to the world in the architectural language of ancient Rome, not as homage, not as quotation, as the thing itself reproduced at full scale, in apparent full fidelity, down to the acoustic properties of the interiors. And here is where the acoustic question enters, because it enters every serious examination of these structures eventually. The buildings of the White City were not known primarily for their visual impact. They were known for their sound. Visitors wrote about this, not all visitors, not the majority. But a consistent thread of visitor accounts, preserved in diaries and letters and published memoirs, describes the experience of being inside the major buildings of the fair as acoustically distinctive in ways that the writers found difficult to explain. The manufacturer's building in particular appears repeatedly in these accounts. Visitors describe a quality of resonance, a peculiar amplification of certain tones, a suspension of ambient noise that they experienced as physical rather than merely auditory. One account, from a visitor identified only by her initials in a Chicago newspaper column from July of 1893, describes standing in the center of the building and perceiving what she called a tone she had felt rather than heard, which stopped when she moved and resumed when she stood still. This is a single account. It does not constitute evidence of anything, but it does not stand alone. And the architectural properties that would produce this kind of experience, large enclosed volumes with specific proportional relationships between height, width, and depth, particular material densities at the surface layer, the deliberate placement of interior structural elements, are not accidental properties. They are designed properties. They require deliberate engineering. And they are the same properties that have been observed by researchers studying acoustic anomalies in structures attributed to far older civilizations. I am not making a causal claim. I am noting a pattern. Here is what the demolition record tells us, and it tells us quite a lot if you read it carefully enough. The official position is that the White City structures were always intended to be temporary, built for a specific event, never designed to last. This is what every general history of the fair states, and it is true that the fair's organizers discussed in advance what would happen to the structures afterward. Some structures were explicitly designated for removal. Others were designated for conversion to permanent use. Here is what is strange: the ratio of what survived to what did not. The buildings that survived were, with one significant exception, the smaller, less acoustically complex, less architecturally anomalous structures. The exception is the Palace of Fine Arts, now the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago's Hyde Park. It survived because it was made of permanent materials according to the official record, and because it was specifically designated to become a museum. It is the building, among the major structures of the fair, whose construction is most straightforwardly documented and whose materials are most consistently explained. The buildings that were demolished were the ones that do not fit: the Administration Building, the Manufactures and Liberal Arts Building, the Agricultural Building, the Electricity Building, which housed one of Nikola Tesla's earliest public demonstrations of alternating current infrastructure. These were the largest, the most ornate, the most acoustically engineered, the most proportionally precise structures on the site. They were also the structures for which the construction documentation is most incomplete, and they were the ones that came down. Some of them burned. In July of 1894, a fire swept through several of the remaining structures. The official record attributes it to a combination of factors: squatters who had occupied the abandoned buildings, dry conditions, and accidental ignition. The fire was real. The structures burned. But fires of this kind, fires that gut major structures in a matter of hours, require certain conditions to develop and sustain themselves. Staff and plaster do not burn well. Wood frames do. If the internal structure of the buildings was primarily wooden, as the staff construction method would imply, then the fire is explainable on its own terms. But if the internal structure was something else, something denser, something inconsistent with the temporary construction model, then the fire performed a function beyond destruction. It resolved an evidence problem. I am not saying the fire was deliberate. I am saying that the fire's consequences, in terms of what it removed from the physical record, served the same purpose as deliberate removal would have. There is something else in the demolition record that deserves attention: the salvage problem. When a major building is demolished, its materials go somewhere. Stone is reused, metal is collected, wood is repurposed. This is not a modern logistical insight. It has always been true. When pre-industrial hospitals were demolished in this same period, researchers have noted that the physical objects from those structures were systematically collected and melted down, or documented as sold without a clear record of the buyer. The physical evidence dispersed in a way that left almost no trace. The White City structures left almost nothing. For a complex that covered 690 acres, that contained 200 buildings, that required an enormous quantity of structural material even under the staff construction model, the salvage record is remarkably thin. The bronze doors of the Administration Building, a few interior decorative elements, a handful of objects preserved because they were designated as works of art. The material bulk of the complex, the structural material, the architectural fabric, the features that would tell you the most about how the buildings were actually made, that material is unaccounted for. Some of it burned, some of it was hauled to landfill. Some of it, according to demolition records that a researcher I corresponded with spent considerable time reviewing across 3 separate municipal archives, was described in work orders simply as removed and disposed with no further specification. Removed and disposed for the largest building on Earth. The coordination problem deserves to be stated plainly because it belongs at the center of this. The fair's organizing committee had access, almost from the beginning of the planning process, to a level of architectural consensus that is difficult to explain under normal circumstances. Within months of the decision to hold the fair in Chicago, a coherent aesthetic direction had been established, a building program had been designed, an architectural vocabulary had been agreed upon by architects working in different cities who had not previously collaborated at this scale. The Neoclassical mandate, the decision to build the Court of Honor in the vocabulary of Roman imperial architecture was not the result of a protracted debate. It was not resolved by competition. It emerged with what the historical record can only describe as remarkable speed, as the settled direction of the project. Who agreed to this? When? Through what process? Why is the negotiation so compressed in the record? The architects who designed the major buildings, McKim, Mead, and White, Peabody and Stearns, Van Brunt and Howe, George Post, Richard Morris Hunt, were producing, within the nominal timeline, architectural drawings of a complexity and precision that under normal conditions require years of iterative development. They were producing these drawings in months, and they were producing drawings that were mutually consistent in a way that suggests a shared source rather than parallel invention. I want to be careful here because I am moving into territory where the documentation thins and the inference thickens. What I can say with confidence is this: the architectural output of the 1893 fair, in terms of its scale, its internal coherence, its technical precision, and the speed with which it was developed and executed, exceeds what the standard model of architectural production in the late 19th century would predict. And some of the people who executed it appear to have known this, not in the public record, in the private one. Burnham's journals, portions of which are held at the Art Institute of Chicago, contain passages about the design process that read less like a builder's notes and more like a restorer's. The word reveal appears in contexts where a planner would be expected to write design. The word recover appears where you would expect to find build. These may be stylistic choices, they may be metaphors, but they are consistent with something that other researchers working independently in different archives have observed in the private correspondence of others involved in the project. The pattern of language in the private record does not match the language of the public record. This is itself a kind of evidence. Let me now describe the broader frame in which the 1893 fair sits, because it does not sit in isolation. The decade between 1890 and 1900 produced, across the United States and Western Europe, a wave of monumental neoclassical construction that has never been fully explained in terms of its speed and simultaneity. Grand central stations, federal courthouses, state capitals, public libraries, university campuses, municipal buildings, all built in a style that was explicitly Roman, explicitly pre-modern, explicitly the aesthetic vocabulary of a civilization that had been absent from lived practice for over 1,000 years, and all built with a fluency, a confidence, a technical command of that vocabulary that architectural historians treat as a natural consequence of the Beaux-Arts educational tradition. The Beaux-Arts explanation says that architects trained at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris absorbed the classical vocabulary through years of rigorous instruction and applied it in America as a mark of cultural aspiration and institutional prestige. This explanation is real. It is documented. It is substantially true, and yet the scale of production that resulted from this system still exceeds what the system itself can account for. The École des Beaux-Arts produced a finite number of trained architects. Those architects produced a finite volume of work. The documented output of trained Beaux-Arts architects in this period is significant, but does not approach the total volume of neoclassical monumental construction produced in America between 1880 and 1910, which means that either the training was more efficiently transmitted than the institutional records suggest, or the designs themselves were drawn from a source that required less original development than the standard model implies. Where were the drawings coming from? This question has no satisfying answer in the mainstream record. What the mainstream record does tell us is that the 1893 fair served, among other things, as a template. The buildings of the White City were not merely admired, they were measured, photographed, their proportions were recorded, their details were reproduced in architectural publications that circulated through every major professional office in the country. The fair was, in part, a distribution mechanism for an architectural vocabulary. But a vocabulary you have to receive from somewhere. And if the buildings of the White City were not original compositions, if they were instead the reproduction at full scale and with full technical fidelity of an existing architectural tradition, then what the fair actually distributed through those measurements and those photographs and those professional publications was something different from what the official history says it distributed. It would have been not an invented style, but a recovered one. Not a cultural aspiration, but a cultural transmission. Transmission of what, exactly? From where? Through whom? I cannot answer those questions. I can point to the place where the answers should be and note that they are not there. There is one more element of the 1893 fair that belongs in this examination, and it is the element that most directly connects the White City to the broader pattern of displacement that characterizes this entire period, the Electricity Building. The Electricity Building at the 1893 fair was the site of what many technology historians describe as the most consequential public demonstration of the century, before that century had fully begun. Nikola Tesla, working with George Westinghouse, demonstrated a complete alternating current power distribution system at a scale never before publicly shown. The building was lit by Tesla's polyphase current. The demonstrations ran continuously for months. The impact on the subsequent direction of American electrical infrastructure was direct and documented. What is less documented is the nature of some of the other demonstrations that took place in and around the Electricity Building during the fair's run. Tesla's own notes from this period, portions of which are held at the Nikola Tesla Museum in Belgrade and have been reviewed in partial form by researchers, describe experiments conducted at the fair that went beyond the public demonstrations. Experiments involving resonant frequency transmission. Experiments that Tesla described in his private language as touching the same territory as the acoustic properties I mentioned earlier. The relationship between electrical resonance, acoustic resonance, and what Tesla called the fundamental frequencies of living systems. Tesla's work in this area is widely known in outline. It has been popularized and distorted to the point where it is difficult to locate the genuine signal in the noise. What is less known is the specific institutional context in which his resonance research was disrupted. The timing of the systematic undermining of Tesla's funding and professional standing corresponds with the same narrow window in which the old hospitals were demolished, the old therapeutic practices displaced, the old bells removed and melted. It corresponds with the consolidation of the electrical industry under a small number of institutional actors whose interests were served by constraining the public scope of frequency-based technology. Tesla was not marginalized simply because he was impractical. He was marginalized in a specific window, by specific actors, through specific financial and institutional mechanisms, at the same moment that other knowledge systems grounded in frequency and resonance were being systematically removed from public accessibility. That may be coincidence, but coincidences of this character, across this range of domains, within this tight a chronological window, require a different kind of explanation than most historians have offered. I want to leave you with the shape of the problem, because the shape is the thing that matters. In 1893, a city appeared. It was built, the official record says, in under 2 years, on a swamp by a generation of architects who had absorbed a vanished civilization's vocabulary with unprecedented fluency and reproduced it at unprecedented scale. 27 million people walked through it. It was photographed exhaustively. It was praised, analyzed, argued over, and credited with shaping the direction of American architecture for a generation. And then almost all of it was gone. Not gradually, not regionally, gone within 14 months of closing. The largest building on Earth leveled. The acoustic chambers cleared. The material record dispersed. The construction documentation incomplete. The salvage record thinned to the point of disappearance. Why does a civilization demolish the largest thing it ever built within a year of completing it? Why does the private language of the people who built it describe revealing and recovering rather than designing and constructing? Why does the fair's acoustic record, scattered across diaries and letters and published memoirs, describe experiences that correspond to the same frequency ranges now being studied in resonance research? Why does Nikola Tesla's resonance work, conducted in part within these buildings, get disrupted in the same institutional window in which the fair's structures are demolished, and the old acoustic institutions of pre-industrial medicine are being systematically erased across every continent simultaneously? Why are the foundational construction documents of the White City's major structures incomplete in the same category and in the same manner as the foundational records of the pre-industrial hospitals demolished in the same period? Why does the architectural vocabulary of the White City exceed, in technical precision and coherent scale, what the documented educational and professional infrastructure of the period should have been able to produce? And why, when you pull any one of these threads, do you find yourself arriving at the same decade, the same coordinated erasure, the same systematic removal of physical evidence, the same thin salvage record, the same deflection in the mainstream history toward explanations that account for the surface and leave the foundation entirely unexamined? A city appeared. Millions walked through it. It was documented, measured, photographed, and reproduced in architectural journals across the country. And then it came down. The photographs remain. The questions they raise have not been answered. They have, in the main, not been asked. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The city appeared. The city was gone, and almost nothing was saved.